The laughter started with the men in tailored suits. A few sharp chuckles at first from the row of polished investors seated directly behind my father. Then it spread, low and rolling, through the old Charleston probate chamber like wind moving through dry leaves. Even the bailiff pressed his lips together and looked away. My father stood at the plaintiff's table with one hand resting on the walnut rail as though he already owned the room. Silver hair combed sharp, navy suit pressed to a blade edge, he had perfected the art of occupying space. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth as old wood, "my daughter can barely pay rent." More laughter, warmer now, invited. Judge Carlisle leaned back in his chair and folded both hands over his stomach. The corners of his mouth turned upward in the slow, satisfied way of men who enjoy delivering verdicts they've already written, and she expects to control a $31 million estate. The room opened up, open laughter now, unguarded. My stepmother Linda gave one small, elegant clap before covering her mouth as though embarrassed by her own delight. She wasn't embarrassed. Linda never did anything accidentally. I sat at the defense table in my second-hand gray blazer, hands folded in my lap, and let them finish. The chair scraped hardwood when I stood. It was a small sound, but it cut through the laughter the way a knife cuts through silk, cleanly, instantly, leaving silence where noise had been. Every eye in that chamber turned toward me. I looked directly at the judge. "I'm the federally appointed receiver of Whitmore Holdings, effective 8 o'clock this morning." The silence that followed was a different species from the one before it. My father's smile didn't fade so much as evacuate. The color left his face in stages like tide pulling back from shore. And Harold Whitmore, 74 years old, the man Charleston society had deferred to across 4 decades of dinner parties and board meetings, looked, for the first time in his life, afraid. 3 hours earlier, I had stood at the bathroom mirror of my apartment on Rutledge Avenue, adjusting the sleeves of that same gray blazer. 600 square feet above a hardware store, rattling plumbing, a kitchen window that stuck every summer from the harbor humidity, but it was clean and paid for in mine, which was more than a lot of things in my life could claim. The coffee maker hissed while traffic drifted in through the cracked window. I studied my reflection, 46 years old, sensible shoes, faint lines at the corners of my eyes, no diamonds, no signal of power. The city had spent years reading that absence as failure. My father especially. The phone rang at 7:12. I answered on the second ring. "Miss Whitmore," clipped, formal, "this is Thomas Avery, Federal Trust Oversight Office, calling to confirm activation of the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust. Appointment authority transferred as of 800 hours. I closed my eyes. Even knowing the call was coming, hearing the words made something shift in my chest, not triumph, something heavier. More like the moment a door you've leaned against your whole life finally swings open and you realize you've been bracing all along. Harold Whitmore has been formally stripped of all discretionary authority pending forensic review. I was quiet. Then thank you, and I hung up and poured my coffee. No shaking hands, no tears. Granddaddy had spent years preparing me for this morning. I simply hadn't known which morning it would be. The first time Samuel Whitmore tested me, I was 12. The family had gathered at his Sullivan's Island house for one of his elaborate Sunday dinners. Father spent the evening at the far end of the table working investors like a man tending a garden, a planted word here, a cultivated laugh there, while my mother smiled beside him with the particular exhaustion of someone who had long since stopped being surprised. After dessert, Granddaddy called me to his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He handed me a white envelope without a word. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. I stared at it. There's been a mistake. What makes you say that? It's too much. My college fund isn't even this large. He leaned back in his chair and watched me with an expression I wouldn't understand for years. Most children, he said eventually, would have hidden it. I handed the check back. You should tell your accountant. His smile deepened slowly like sunrise. He didn't explain the test that night. Years later, he told me he believed integrity was immediate, not calculated, not performed, but instinctive. Either you reached for what wasn't yours or you didn't. The answer lived before the question finished forming. My father, he confided once, would have kept the check. He already knew that. After my mother died, Harold's edges sharpened into something unrecognizable. She had In the thing that softened him, not changed him, but softened the worst of him, the way certain woods reveal their grain only when something gentle works against them. Without her, there was nothing left to do the softening. 18 months after the funeral, he married Linda Prescott, 20 years younger, perfect posture, polished vowels, the social instincts of a surgeon. Linda understood my father with clinical precision. Harold Whitmore was a man who had spent his entire life trying to earn the approval of a father who valued principle over achievement, and Samuel had never fully trusted him. That wound had never closed. Linda fed it carefully. "You built this company into something greater than Samuel ever imagined," she would tell him. "You deserve total control." He believed her because he needed to. Men who hunger for approval rarely examine what feeds them. When my husband Michael got sick, I left Charleston. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I would have given 14 years for 14 more months. What we got was 14 months, and I would do every one of them again without hesitation. Cleveland winters are a particular kind of relentless, snow pressing against windows in heavy drifts, the world muffled white and still. Hospice set a narrow bed in our living room because Michael wanted to face the window, said he liked watching the snowfall, said it reminded him the world could still be beautiful even while disappearing. By that last winter, the cancer had taken most of his strength. His hands, once broad from years of repair work, had gone thin as paper over bone. One night about 3 weeks before the end, he woke after midnight and found me sitting beside him in the dark. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "You should go home." "This is home." "No, quiet but certain, Charleston. There's nothing there for me." He studied me with the particular patience of a man who has run out of time for anything but truth. "You've spent your whole life waiting for your father to see you clearly." I looked away. "He never will," Michael said softly. "Stop building your worth around someone else's blindness." I cried quietly beside his bed while snow moved past the window. He passed 17 days later with my hand in his. After the funeral, I sat alone in our apartment, staring at the empty recliner by the window, and I understood something for the first time. Freedom often arrives disguised as grief because when the illusion finally dies, what remains is painful, but real. That was the gift Michael left me, not the best gift he gave me, but the one that saved my life. I came back to Charleston with almost nothing, no money, no husband, no clear direction, but I no longer needed Harold Whitmore's approval to know my own worth. That changed everything. Father told anyone who asked that I had squandered my inheritance, lacked discipline, fallen apart. He said it so smoothly and so often that Charleston society received it as established fact. Poor Evelyn couldn't manage life. While he told that story at the Carolina Yacht Club, I worked part-time at the Charleston Public Library, studied estate law at night, volunteered with an organization that investigated financial elder abuse. I learned how greed leaves fingerprints. I learned how pride always overplays its hand. And Granddaddy's sealed trust waited, silent, patient, until Harold made his move. Last month, he filed a probate action to consolidate full ownership of Whitmore Holdings under sole authority, his. That filing triggered the dormant succession clause exactly as Samuel had designed it, not dramatically, quietly, bureaucratically, with the clean efficiency of a mechanism that had been waiting years to engage. And so here we were. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Carlisle's voice split the silence like a crack of wood. "Explain this immediately." No one moved, not my father, not Linda, not the lawyers who had spent 40 minutes polishing my humiliation into legal argument. The old courthouse had gone still in that particular southern way, where silence sounds louder than shouting. I folded my hands. My grandfather established the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust 17 years ago. It contained a dormant succession clause, triggered by any attempt to consolidate Whitmore Holdings through probate manipulation. Across the aisle, Linda's color drained so completely she looked like a photograph left too long in sunlight. She understood immediately what my father had not yet processed. Harold's own petition had sprung the trap. He had built it himself and walked directly into it. "And you were named successor receiver," the judge said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" The question landed harder than the law had. Why you? It was the question my father had asked in 100 different registers across 40 years. I glanced toward Harold. His expression had moved past anger into something I recognized with a stark, genuine bewilderment. He truly didn't understand. He had spent his whole life believing power worked through leverage, scheme, and calculation. the idea of another answer had never occurred to him. The answer had begun at a textile mill outside Somerville when I was 6 years old. Granddaddy took me to Whitmore Textile Plant No. 3 while other Charleston children attended writing lessons and piano recitals. He believed children learned more from honest work than polite applause. The mill was enormous, brick walls black with age, looms clattering like controlled thunder, the air thick with cotton dust and machine oil. I remember clutching his hand as we walked the production floor, my small fingers swallowed inside his broad palm. He stopped every few feet. "Morning, Earl. How's your wife? Tell your boy congratulations on the scholarship, Janet. Good to see you back, Miguel. Heard your mother's surgery went well." He knew every name, every story, not because he had studied them, because he cared about them. Afterward, drinking lemonade from paper cups in his office, he explained the business to me, not profits, not valuations, people. "These machines matter because families depend on them," he said. "A company that forgets its people becomes a machine itself, and machines have no conscience." I was 6, I didn't fully understand, but I remembered. Harold had forgotten, or perhaps never truly learned. Granddaddy never forgot. The autumn I was 29, Granddaddy called me to his study. He had grown quieter that year. Age had curved his shoulders slightly, though his mind remained sharp enough to silence any attorney in Charleston. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not weak, just worn thin by something specific. The fire in the hearth crackled softly despite the October warmth. His bourbon sat untouched beside his chair. "Do you know why your father has spent his life resenting me?" I shook my head. "Because he believes trust is earned through success." He gestured for me to sit, but trust isn't awarded for achievement, it's revealed through character. He slid a legal folder across the desk. Inside, trust documents, corporate structures, federal escrow certifications. At 29, I understood perhaps half of it. "You're naming me." "Only if Harold forces my hand." The fire popped softly, neither of us spoke for a moment. "Why would he force it?" Granddaddy looked toward the flames, because men who hunger for control rarely recognize when enough has become too much. I stared at the folder. "I don't want this." "I know," he met my eyes steadily. "That is precisely why you must have it." I looked up. "Your father wants ownership because he believes it will finally prove his worth," he said quietly. "But ownership never heals insecurity, it magnifies it." His voice lowered. "If the day comes when this activates, promise me one thing." "What?" "Save the company, not the fortune, the people." I nodded through tears I hadn't expected. He smiled then, the same steady, warm smile he'd worn my whole life. "Good girl." He died 6 weeks later in his sleep, peacefully. At the funeral, my father cried harder than I had ever seen. Even then, standing at the grave, I knew some of those tears came from somewhere beyond grief. He had lost his last chance to finally be chosen. And some men spend their whole lives chasing what pride will never let them receive. Back in the courtroom, I met the judge's eyes. "That's why he chose me, Your Honor." The old clock on the rear wall ticked. My father looked smaller, not physically, spiritually, like a man who has just realized he has been solving the wrong equation his entire life. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "He would have told me." "No, Father," I held his gaze. "He wouldn't." The truth hit him harder than any accusation, precisely because deep down Harold Whitmore already knew it was true, had always known. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore's probate authority is suspended pending immediate forensic review." Gasps from the gallery. Linda grabbed Harold's sleeve. "Do something." But there was nothing left to do. For the first time in 74 years, Harold Whitmore had no move available. The courtroom doors opened. 3 federal forensic auditors walked in carrying sealed black cases. The lead investigator, tall, iron-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, approached the bench with the unhurried authority of someone who has done this many times and finds it neither pleasurable nor dramatic, simply necessary. "Your Honor, we've identified substantial evidence of concealed fiduciary misconduct." My father turned toward me slowly. And I realized something that surprised me. He wasn't afraid of prosecution. He was afraid that Granddaddy had been right about him all along. The sound Linda made was small and sharp, like a hairline crack appearing in expensive porcelain. Special Auditor Karen Dorsey laid document after document on the bench with me. Methodical precision, wire transfers, shell corporations, loan structures arranged through layered Delaware and Nevada holding companies, luxury coastal developments in Florida, speculative resort properties in the Carolinas, private offshore accounts dressed in the language of growth investment. Not crude theft, something more sophisticated and, in its way, more dishonest, the kind of greed that wears legality as a costume and dares anyone to look carefully enough. Approximately $11.4 million in concealed liabilities. Even in Charleston, where old money has always known how to stay quiet, that number landed like a structural collapse. Were these liabilities disclosed to your board? The judge asked. My father swallowed, no. To trust oversight. Silence. Answer the question, Mr. Whitmore. No, the word came out brittle and small. I had never, in 46 years, heard fear break through Harold Whitmore's voice. The sound of it undid something in me. This wasn't the moment he had become this man. It was simply the moment everyone else finally saw him clearly. The evidence had begun revealing itself months earlier, on an ordinary evening at the library. I was cross-referencing trust property tax filings when a valuation caught my attention. A Hilton Head development listed under a corporate shell I recognized from Whitmore Holdings disclosures, but with a debt structure that made no sense. Too aggressive, too leveraged, no visible rationale. I checked another, then another. By midnight I had 6 discrepancies. By 2 a.m. the pattern had resolved into something unmistakable. My father was mortgaging the company's future to manufacture the illusion of present success, dressing risk as vision, calling recklessness innovation, counting applause as evidence of wisdom. Classic insecurity economics. I sat beneath the soft yellow reading lamps and stared at the numbers until my coffee went cold. Then I thought of Granddaddy's voice, ownership never heals insecurity, it magnifies it. That was the night I contacted Federal Trust Oversight and submitted formal activation evidence under the Dormant Succession Clause. The process moved quietly, professionally, without theater, exactly as Samuel designed it. He had understood something my father never did. Real power rarely announces itself, it simply arrives when it's needed. Auditor Dorsey's voice had been steady throughout. It was only when she opened a second folder and paused, a pause that felt different from the others, like a reader stopping at the worst page, that something shifted in the room. Your Honor, there is one further matter requiring immediate attention. What matter? We've located evidence suggesting Mrs. Linda Whitmore may have participated directly in fraudulent asset concealment. Linda's hands released Harold's sleeve as though the fabric had turned hot. What did you say? Her voice had lost every syllable of its cultivated composure. Your authorization appears on multiple concealed transfer approvals tied to Seaview Coastal Development and Marshate Holdings. Her eyes snapped to Harold, and what passed between them in that instant was not love, not accusation, it was recognition, the terrible kind, the kind that lives between two people who have lied to each other carefully for years and now, suddenly, cannot stop seeing it. You told me those signatures were procedural, she said. His jaw tightened. Keep your voice down. She laughed, an actual laugh, sharp and disbelieving, echoing off the paneled walls. Keep my voice down. Then she turned to face the judge, and in the space of 3 seconds, Linda Whitmore performed the fastest social transformation I had ever witnessed. Shoulders back, expression settled into dignified betrayal, the trembling in her hands gone. Your Honor, I was deliberately misled regarding these transactions. I signed where counsel instructed. Effective immediately, I will cooperate fully with investigators and seek legal separation from Mr. Whitmore. Harold stared at her. 19 years of polished dinners and social ambitions and whispered reassurances, abandoned in 30 seconds. He gave a dry, mirthless laugh. You always were efficient. She didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the doors, each step clicking across the hardwood floor with quiet finality. No backward glance. The heavy doors closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. Harold Whitmore stood alone. The papers had what they needed. Charleston Post and Courier ran the headline the following morning, WHIT Mori fortune frozen in federal trust shakeup. By noon, local television was looping footage of Harold leaving court under federal escort. He looked smaller on screen, not diminished by age but by exposure. The architecture of his public self had come down. I spent the first week in Granddaddy's old office on Meeting Street, reviewing records with Auditor Dorsey and a team of forensic accountants. The room. Hadn't changed much since Samuel died. Dark oak shelves, brass reading lamp, the faint ghost of pipe tobacco pressed deep into the walls. Sitting behind his desk felt strange, too large, like wearing a coat cut for someone with broader shoulders. Gradually that feeling passed, not because I grew into the size but because I stopped thinking about size. Granddaddy hadn't given me this to fill, he'd given me this to use. One evening Dorsey stood at the window reviewing spreadsheets while harbor lights scattered across the water below us. "Can the company survive?" I asked. She was quiet longer than I expected. "With the right leadership, yes." I almost smiled. Leadership was a word that didn't naturally attach to a part-time librarian who clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper. Dorsey must have read the expression, "What? I don't exactly look the part." She gave me a long, measuring look. Then, the people most suited to power are usually the ones least interested in possessing it. It sounded like something Samuel would have said. Hearing it from a tired federal auditor in practical shoes made it truer somehow. The first time I addressed the Whitmore Holdings staff, nearly 300 workers filled plant number 3. The same mill, the same thunder of looms, the same smell of cotton dust and machine oil. Most of them looked wary. They had endured years of Harold's polished expansion speeches and knew the grammar of corporate theater. They were waiting for another performance. I stood on the loading platform in my plain gray blazer and told them the truth. The company is carrying serious hidden debt. A murmur, I let it settle. Executive bonuses are suspended immediately. Speculative development exposure is being liquidated. Debt restructuring begins next week. Faces tightened. They'd heard enough corporate language to know that sequence usually ended with layoffs. No hourly worker will lose pension protection under my authority. The room went quiet in a different way. An older machinist near the front crossed his arms. His name tag read Earl Harrison. "How can you promise that?" And then I remembered him. "Because in 1986 your wife needed bypass surgery and your insurance denied the claim, and your grandfather covered your deductible personally." Earl's arms unfolded. "I remember him remembering," I said. Silence, then Earl Harrison gave one slow, deliberate nod. That nod changed the temperature of the entire room. Trust doesn't arrive in speeches, it arrives quietly in a single moment of honest recognition. Harold moved into a modest assisted living apartment on the west side of the city, not because his health required it, because nearly every account he controlled had been frozen and the South Battery house sat under temporary trust possession. Charleston's social world adjusted with the efficiency it always reserves for these situations. Invitations stopped. The golf club board accepted his resignation with regret carefully calibrated to convey none. Friends who had eaten at his table for decades suddenly discovered persistent scheduling conflicts. That, too, is something Granddaddy understood. Some relationships are transactions that have learned to mimic warmth. I arranged anonymous monthly payments to cover Harold's apartment, modest enough. When Dorsey discovered the transfer, she frowned at the ledger. "Because he's still my father," I said before she could ask. She nodded once and left it there. I assumed that was the end of it. 3 months later, just after lunch, my office phone rang. "Why are you paying my rent?" His voice was quieter than I remembered. Something in the texture of it had changed, the practiced resonance was gone. What remained was just a voice, old, a little uncertain. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Harold Whitmore said 5 words I had not heard from him in 46 years. "I need to see you." I said yes. I drove to the apartment on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Charleston, in that brief season between summer heat and winter cold, the city remembers how to breathe, the oaks still heavy with Spanish moss drifting like old lace in the breeze. I sat in the parking lot a moment, both hands on the steering wheel. The building was clean and unremarkable. Beige brick, white trim, a Methodist church on one side, a small pharmacy on the other. Nothing like the South Battery mansion. No wrought iron, no harbor view, no gleaming town car. Just a quiet, ordinary place where old men played checkers in the lobby. Pride has trouble surviving in ordinary places, that's why I was glad to see it. Unit 214, the brass numbers were slightly crooked. When the door opened, I didn't quite recognize him at first, not because of age but because of the absence of performance. a plain blue cardigan, khakis that hadn't been pressed, hair thinner than I remembered, a spot near his jaw where he'd missed while shaving. No exec. You'd smile, no carefully constructed posture, just an old man who had answered his own door. He stepped aside. The apartment was tidy, narrow sofa, half-filled bookshelf, a small table with 2 coffee cups and a plate of untouched sugar cookies. He had prepared for my arrival. That hit me harder than I expected. Would you like coffee? Harold Whitmore had never made his own coffee in my memory. Yes. I could hear the awkward clatter of ceramic from the kitchenette. When he returned, he handed me a mug and sat carefully in the chair across from me. We held our cups and listened to the faint sound of traffic. Then he said very quietly, "You always took it black." Such a small observation, such an unexpectedly careful one, I didn't know what to do with it. Yes. Another silence, long enough to become something other than uncomfortable. I'm sorry. The room rearranged itself around those 2 words. I had imagined hearing them countless times, in anger, in private triumph, in dreams that left me aching when I woke. Now that they had actually arrived, they felt nothing like I'd expected, not dramatic, fragile, like something that could be broken by the wrong response. I set my coffee down. For what? He gave a small, sad laugh. Then he looked at me in a way I had never been looked at by my father, directly, without agenda, without management. When your mother died, he said, I didn't know how to be anyone else. He stared at his hands. My whole life I spent trying to earn Samuel's respect, every promotion, every acquisition, every public success. His fingers tightened. I thought eventually he would look at me and say, enough, you are enough, but he never did. I thought of Granddaddy's steady eyes, his quiet standards. And I understood, perhaps for the first time, the precise shape of the wound. Samuel hadn't withheld love from Harold, he had withheld approval. Harold believed he was owed it. That distinction, so simple, so devastating, had cost 40 years. When he trusted you instead of me, Harold swallowed. I couldn't bear it, so I told myself you were weak, because admitting otherwise meant admitting why he trusted you. He looked up, his eyes were wet. And then Michael got sick, his voice dropped lower. You loved him the way your mother loved me, completely, without bargaining for worth. He shook his head slowly. I envied that. I felt the tears before I was aware of crying. When Michael died, I said quietly, I thought losing him meant losing the only person who had ever really seen me. And then something happened that I had never once, in 46 years, witnessed. Harold Whitmore wept. Not politely, not with restrained dignity. He wept openly, shoulders shaking, all the carefully controlled grief of a lifetime breaking open in that small, beige, ordinary room. I moved before I thought about it, crossed the space between us and sat beside him. His hand found mine. We stayed like that for a long time, 2 people, at last honest enough to mourn what pride had stolen from both of us. Eventually his breathing steadied. He wiped his face and stared at the fading light through the curtains. I thought success meant never needing anyone, he whispered. No, I said, it means becoming someone safe enough to be needed. He turned toward me slowly, and there, for the first time in my life, I saw it in Harold Whitmore's face. Not judgment, not disappointment, not the practiced calculation I had grown up reading. Recognition. As if he were finally seeing the daughter who had been standing in front of him all along. His voice was barely audible. Your grandfather chose wisely. And for the first time since I was a little girl, I believed he meant it. A year later, plant number 3 smelled the same. Cotton dust, machine oil, the familiar thunder of looms. But the debt was gone, restructured without sacrificing a single worker pension. The speculative developments had been liquidated. Board seats had been opened to employee representation for the first time in the company's history. The Samuel Whitmore Foundation now provided permanent educational grants to Charleston County libraries that had struggled for years under shrinking public budgets. That part mattered most to me. Libraries had given me everything during the years I had nothing else. It seemed right that the family name should finally be attached to open doors rather than locked ones. The dedication ceremony for the Samuel Whitmore Education Center was held on a cool November afternoon. New building beside the old mill, red brick matched to the historic structure, a courtyard full of workers and their families. Children chased each other between folding chairs. Older employees traded stories about Granddaddy. Earl Harrison stood near the front in his best suit, his wife beside him. When he saw me, he tipped his head. I had just stepped toward the podium when I saw him. Harold at the back of the crowd, a plain charcoal suit. That had been altered down from better years, thinner now. Age had found him, perhaps because pride was no longer holding it at bay. We looked at each other across the courtyard, then he gave me a small, quiet nod and smiled. Not the old public smile, not the one for donors and photographers, something smaller, uncertain, real. I smiled back. When my speech ended, I invited Harold to the podium. A murmur moved through the crowd. Charleston still remembered everything. People weren't sure what to expect. He walked slowly to the microphone and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the gathered families, the children at the library doors, the workers whose livelihoods had survived his failures, the company his father had built and his daughter had brought back. When he spoke, his voice was rough. My father spent his life teaching a lesson I refused to learn. The courtyard went still. He glanced toward me, then back to the crowd. For most of my life, I believed success meant being admired. A pause, the wind moved through the oak trees above us. I was wrong. He drew a breath. My daughter saved what I nearly destroyed because she understood something I never did. His eyes found mine, held there. She became the person I should have been. No one moved, no one whispered. Earl Harrison began to clap, slowly, once, twice. Then the whole courtyard joined him, not for redemption, not for status, but for the simple, rare courage of telling the truth when it costs something. Later, after the crowd had thinned, we sat together on a bench outside the library. Evening light stretched long across the courtyard bricks. Inside, through the tall windows, children's laughter drifted out into the cooling air. Harold looked at the building for a long time. "He would have liked this," he said softly. "Yes." A comfortable silence settled between us, the kind built from understanding rather than avoidance. After a while, he turned to me. "Do you think he forgave me?" I thought about it carefully, about a man who had handed a 12-year-old girl a test she didn't know she was taking, about a sealed trust waiting patiently for 17 years, about a study that smelled of pipe tobacco and the steady voice of someone who believed character was more durable than circumstance. "I think," I said, "he always hoped you'd forgive yourself." Harold's eyes filled. He nodded slowly. Then he looked back toward the library where the windows glowed gold against the coming dark and children were reading inside a building made from second chances. We sat there together until the light was gone. Wealth is not what we accumulate, it is what we protect for others. Pride builds empires that collapse, character builds things that last. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the truest form of strength is not the justice you deliver, but the grace you find afterward, for the people who least deserved it and needed it most. I learned that from a man who died before I understood him. And I learned it again from the daughter he trusted to carry it forward. Which, in the end, was the same thing.